Hey Lindsay, how you doing?
Hi. Good, thanks. You?
Good, very good. Yeah, so today we're talking about borderline personality disorder, also known as emotionally unstable personality disorder. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's a more UK-based term
yeah,
that's used. Mm,
but it's
mm.
kind of it feels a little bit kinder in a way saying it like that. Maybe BPD has some connotations and some stigma associated to it that I think doesn't help.
I mean, I think the language generally,
Mm.
if we were to think of ourselves of having a personality that's disordered, I think that's feels really tricky as it is. But yeah, certainly I think emotionally unstable gives a slightly better insight into some of the types of experiences people might be having when we're
Yeah.
thinking about this.
And I think where we begin is really just talking about what it might feel like for somebody that
Mm.
has this.
Yeah, so mm, I guess there may be different ways in which people experience. So throwing out maybe some of the generalized sense of what it might be like is a real sense of dysregulation emotionally,
Mm,
being quite afraid of rejection or abandonment, and as a result, relationships might either be quite unstable or really develop quite intensely. Um, I guess it's going to impact our sense of self, our identity, our self image. May well see impulsivity as part of the picture. May well also see self harm or suicidal behavior, a real sense of heightened emotions. But we may also see the other side in terms of that sort of much more dissociative, shut down type experiences as well. So a broad spectrum of experiences. But I guess as far as lists go, that doesn't sound like a particularly easy way to live life, does it?
no. And I think the kind of that chronic emptiness that someone might
Mm,
feel when they have this.
mm,
People I've worked with that have this sort of presentation or formulation, it's really hard for them to navigate life. It's really hard to be here. And, and I think that from time to time you just want to dissociate because it's just too hard to be here and
yeah.
and navigate life and do things. It's tricky. Mm.
I mean, at its core, it's challenges in sort of relational interactions, and so much in life
Mm.
relies on other people, relies on us being in relationship with others. So it's very hard not to be in situations that could feel activating or difficult. It's I think leads to a lot of roller coaster type experiences based on the experiences we have with others.
Yeah. And it's kind of maybe interesting for us to look a little bit like where does it come from? How does somebody, are they born with it? Does it develop? Like what happens here?
So it's often associated with the experiences we have in growing up. So thinking about the caregiving that we experience, if our needs, our emotional needs, don't feel met in a consistent, reliable, and predictable way, we, I guess, work in ways to try and make those situations more manageable. And from that, we learn patterns and ways of functioning in our environments that help us to make our very basic human needs met. So we would think of, I mean, you tend to use language of a personality adaptation rather than
Mm.
disorder, because I think that really helps us think about how so often we have learned to adapt to respond to the environment that we grow up in. And I guess that becomes our internal working model. When we're
Mm.
doing all of that growing up and making sense of ourselves, the world, other people, how to function. If our environment teaches us that we need to be certain ways in order to get those needs met, those patterns then become more established. Diagnostically, we wouldn't typically see someone attract a label of personality disorder before the age of 18, because obviously they're still in sort of developing and still seeing. So we might see traits, but yeah, it would be an adult based diagnostic
And
process.
if it is an adaptation, that kind of suggests loosely that something's happened in their home as a young
Mhm.
person. They felt maybe neglected, maybe a bit abandoned.
Mhm.
or their caregivers were unstable themselves and disorganized in the way that they attached, whether it
Mm.
be, anxious or kind of fear of pushing away. And, you know, I think, is there a consistency of what kind of caregiving would result in this kind of adaptation?
And I guess I'm being careful because I don't do diagnosing, but I guess being aware of what we would think of as leading to the development of these types of presentations, it's often the inconsistency.
Mm,
I think one of the difficulties around a label is that it can feel as though families are blamed or have caused or done something, and sometimes that's the case. We often talk about the difference between big T traumas and little T traumas. So the little T traumas being far more relational and chipping away at someone's sense of safety, emotional safety, growing up. So we would often see that where things aren't consistently safe, where it doesn't feel psychologically safe, the person adapts to their environment. So it would often be associated. I guess I'm wondering if you're getting at kind of attachment type language,
mm,
thinking about a disorganized attachment pattern would often be what we would think of, but not exclusively. But yeah, it's where I guess it's the relational experiences that a person's had growing up in
mm.
their environment shape things a great deal.
And it's interesting that you say it's not necessarily always parents' fault, because, the same child growing up in the same environment might adapt differently. And I think it's also the disposition of the child themselves. If that person is very, very sensitive to
Mhm,
micro expressions and micro,
mhm.
relational sort of attachment things, like that might lead to that person actually feeling abandoned unintentionally. There's
And
also
it's always the
other
blend. Yeah.
Yes, and there's also other reasons for abandonment. Sometimes children are separated from their caregivers, cruelly, and then they have this kind of sense of attachment disorder. So it's I think one of the key things that I've really understood with people that I've worked with that have this kind of formulation or presentation is relationships feel like life or death to them. It's like abandonment is not just experienced as like a loss, it's like a complete annihilation of themselves. It's like I cease to exist as a person if I lose this relationship. I will just collapse as a person, or I will disappear, or I will fragment or fall apart if I lose this person. So the core that I've really understood or experienced is that the panic that is
Mhm.
associated with that loss, the potential loss of that person, is really hard for someone that has this sort of adaptation.
And it may not be accompanied with the thoughts of I will disintegrate if dot dot dot, but that gripping fear that
Mm,
then compels us to act in certain ways to try and prevent or deter the thing we fear from happening, is certainly very common in this presentation. Yeah.
but that kind of then just leads to a lot of kind of unfair, I suppose myths or something around it, where the person is, well, they're just being really clingy or they're being really manipulative, or yeah, let's just talk a little bit about, because of this happening, people can really misunderstand people that are experiencing this adaptation, right?
I think often the behaviors aren't seen as someone's real attempt to make themselves feel safer or to prevent something that they're really afraid of happening from happening. And I think that narratives, around clingy, as you say, attention seeking, manipulative, are thrown around and I think impact individuals, but also impact care that can be given. So I think that it's often the push pull that people experience that they may find tricky being in relationship with someone who has this presentation. um, these terms are thrown around perhaps to
Mm,
describe the difficulty in supporting or being with or being around this type of behavior. But it really doesn't do justice to the fact that someone is really doing their very best to avoid something that they're finding incredibly scary from happening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's kind of, it must be so horrible to feel like this all the time. And I think I always imagine, somebody that is in this position, what it's like to be them, as much as it can be tough to be on the receiving end of this, because there is this kind of unstable,
Mm.
presentation. It's 10 times worse for the person actually experiencing it.
And the very thing that a person might be seeking or wanting or hoping for are consistent, stable connections with other people. And it might just feel really elusive.
Yeah.
The efforts to try and preserve those relationships
Mm.
might be the very thing that ends up bringing about the instability in
Yeah.
relationships, whether that's friendships with family members, romantic relationships, kind of across the board. It feels
Yeah.
like a particularly cruel twist, doesn't it? That, yeah, the very things a person's trying to prevent might actually be brought about by the ways they're responding and trying to cope and survive.
Yeah. It's quite hard to, kind of get the diagnosis though, and it can often be mislabeled along the journey. You know, chronic PTSD, for example,
Hmm.
people can think, okay, well, you've had a lot of trauma, so you actually have CPTSD, but there's also
Hmm.
substance use disorders. And I think obviously in your work, you see this as well, right? With eating disorders.
And I work with a lot of really great psychiatrists through my career, and I think they would all acknowledge that when we're assessing, or when they're assessing someone through a diagnostic perspective, it's a snapshot in time, and you do your best to gather the history and to make the most informed decision you can based on what you're seeing. But the picture can evolve and change over time, which means that diagnostic labels might shift and change over time. But certainly, I think that there can be overlap and similarities with some other diagnostic or labels. But also, I think often, if you've lived your life or if you have experienced trauma, these relational difficulties might not be the only difficulties that you face. So it might be that there may be substance misuse has developed alongside as a means of coping, or eating disorders or psychosis might be part of the presentation, because actually when we've led a life that has felt difficult or traumatic in some way, that can play out in multiple different ways. I guess as a psychologist, we would hold that within the formulation, but certainly from colleagues' point of view, thinking about how we're best conceptualizing what we're seeing, that would be the process of trying to unpick and name it through a diagnostic process.
Yeah. And just
And I guess it
speaking,
takes me to
go ahead.
we both jumped in with thoughts at the same time there, but I guess it just took me to some other myths around that medication is the main treatment, and or that
Mm,
people can't recover, in air quotes. And I think those are myths as well. I think
yeah.
being a fundamentally relational um, issue, it is resolved most reliably through relational work, through therapeutic work, and I know talking that in a bit, but also thinking about how this sense of it is a person's personality that is fundamentally disordered or broken, whatever language you want to put to that, in some way, and that then recovery isn't possible, that this is intrinsic to the person. Whereas actually what we see is that with the work that can be done, certainly there can be shifts in the distress the person experiences, in the ways that they cope when they are feeling distress, that can shift as well.
But
Mm.
some people can have a completely, transformational experience if
Mhm.
they kind of do the work. And I think that's the important piece of hope to
Yeah.
stand by in all of this, is that all the change is possible. And you know, it just, yeah, I suppose it takes that kind of relational work to really make the
Mm.
difference. I mean, from a psychotherapy lens perspective, the view of BPD is a lot more about it being, a kind of a lack of continuity in how you experience yourself. So it's a sort of more of a disorder of self, not just mood instability or impulsivity or trauma, but it's just that sense of not feeling yourself,
Mm.
or your cohesion or consciousness of yourself. So
Mm.
the work in a psychotherapy way is it's kind of in the space of limbic resonance and in the right hemispheric work, because we see it as a right hemispheric type disorder where the studies that have been done psychotherapeutically are more around the P3 waves of the brain are kind of split, or they don't work like they do with a neurotypical person. So what we do is work on the right hemispheric side. So that might be involve play or conversation, or proto conversation, like with a mother to child. It's sort of focusing on the feelings and focusing on how somebody is actually experiencing the world, and almost doing that to reparent the person back to a state of cohesion of the self.
When we're thinking about neurological correlates, I really have found the phrase neurons that fire together wire together really
Mm.
powerful. So thinking about not only where some of those disruptions might be in some of the P3 waves, but also thinking about, even I guess taken at a layman's level, it just makes sense to me that if we consistently respond in certain ways to certain types of emotions or certain types of experiences, that becomes a very well-trodden path. So
Mm.
it becomes far more habitual, which is then reinforced by our neurology, that actually that becomes a well-trodden path in many, many ways. And I think that that then really helps when you're thinking about how do we integrate some of that into the work, into the recovery process, to really try and rewire things and to open up different ways of responding. But I think also to destigmatize that when we maybe have been responding in a way for a long time to certain types of situations, just because we might know we would like it to be different, it doesn't mean that then in those moments we haven't got all sorts of pulls to try and respond in ways that feel familiar. Because often, even
Yeah.
though it might be unhelpful, if it's familiar, it can often feel psychologically safer in that moment. So there is a lot of work, I guess, to unpick some of that and to safely learn different ways of doing things.
Yeah. And I think if somebody has this adaptation, it's not your fault you have this adaptation. Like something's happened for you relationally where you didn't feel attuned to as a young person,
Mhm.
and you felt isolated or abandoned as a young person. So you've your psyche or self has now adapted in a particular way to try and navigate life. And it doesn't mean that, that's true, that you are empty and you're going to be there like this forever. And I think some of the things is that you go through life, and unfortunately, we have reenactment patterns as we walk through
Mm.
life, where those, relational attunements that didn't happen when we were younger, those same impingements happen in adult life. A
Mm.
friend abandons us, partner, leaves us, etc. And those repeated kind of impingements really knock the stuffing out of you. And then you start to feel my feelings are just all wrong, and I'm all wrong, and my experience isn't real, and everybody leaves, and
Mm.
that can kind of happen, but it isn't um, necessarily permanent. And I think there's a lot that actually can be done therapeutically
Mm.
to mend this relational wound that the person has at their core.
And I guess thinking, some of the things you named there are things that most people have experienced at some point in their lives, and those are the kind of the bigger events. But I think they're so often on the sort of a day-to-day basis. We've sent a message in asking something of someone or to someone, reaching out in some way, and then there might be a delay in getting a response. And if the person is of a mind of, well, they were probably busy, I'm sure they'll respond as soon as they can, that's one thing. But it might be that we're wired to think, oh no, I shouldn't have said this. What are they going to be thinking? They probably, it's a no, whatever we might be imagining. It can create a very different experience of that gap in hearing back from someone. And those types of small experiences about fears of rejection or abandonment could be happening many multiples of times a day, which creates it's exhausting, I
It is
imagine. Yeah.
exhausting. Yeah.
Mm.
And traumatic. Like,
Mm.
all these micro moments that for some people are sort of easier to navigate. For a person that has this adaptation, every single event is traumatic.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard. So let's talk a little bit about what can somebody do if they have this or they think they might have this, because there is a lot of hope and there's so much work and studies and research being done into, what people can do. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Mm. There is, I guess, there's a good evidence base about certain types of therapies that are thought to be quite helpful at really leaning into both the skills around how we work with our own emotions and those of others. Dialectical behavior therapy,
Mm.
DBT, is commonly used as a way of sort of building a way of approaching relational situations, but also has got a really strong skills component around learning new ways to respond. So quite a skills-based approach that can be really helpful for people. Mentalization-based therapy. So that's often where we are thinking about how we focus on what I have my mind and you have your mind, and that they are separate, so that we start to be able to tease apart some of that mind reading that can occur when we assume we know what someone's thinking or
Yeah.
feeling, and fearing the worst and the impact that has on us. So just thinking about how that can be a helpful way of responding as well. um, Schema therapy, looking at your
Mm.
sort of your internal schemas, your internal working models, can be really helpful as well. But I don't know, what about you?
Well, I come from when it comes to working depth with people. So obviously as a coaching psychologist, the work that I do is sort of split into categories. So, I'm either working with executives and high performance people in a more structured approach, or if I'm working in this kind of depth way, I do psychotherapy in the conversational model. And there's been a lot of studies and evidence base around the success of the conversational model. They've actually done kind of studies where they've tested DBT against conversational model just to see what actually happens for people that present with
Mhm.
BPD adaptation. And so the psychodynamic psychotherapies like CM, it's it's creating this like universe of what they call alone togetherness. So it's a quality of relating in which a person feels sort of accompanied without being intruded upon. And
Okay.
instead of in these conversations that emerge, you're not giving advice or direction or practical steps. You're following the person's like stream of consciousness and reflecting back in a way that starts to build their cohesion of self. So there's limbic resonance, there's reflection, there's integration, there's kind of a coherence or linking or sense made of their
Mm.
world. And that's why I say it's a little bit kind of less concrete work than psychological type work, because it is working in this right hemispheric plane. So a little bit trickier in a way to navigate. But these links that get made, the sort of the patterns that start to build, it helps the person then form that sense of self that has felt fragmented for so long. So
Mm.
I think with all of these different, therapeutic interventions and possibilities out there, I mean, there's just a lot of hope, really.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of really good research of what can be done now. Mm.
Absolutely. And we've spoken in a previous episode about compassion and self-compassion,
Mm.
and just thinking about the importance of it's not my fault and it is my responsibility. So we're thinking about really looking at the experiences we've had, how they've shaped us,
Mm.
how we can learn and grow in and move towards living a life that we want, without sort of the stigmatizing and the self-shaming, that can so often be what people experience. So I would
Yeah.
certainly, but maybe that's, I don't know, just my professional orientation, like healthy doses of compassion sprinkled in.
Nothing wrong with that.
No, but it brings me to this interesting, I guess, in some ways, a dilemma in that therapy itself is a relational process. So, if what someone finds threatening in at different points are relationships with others, often you want to think about that in the therapeutic process as well, because a therapist might get sick and might cancel a session. But what if you'd had a really intense session the week before? How might that land for someone thinking, oh, this, why have they cancelled? What's that about? Was that because we had this conversation last time? So it is a real sort of moving with I guess, a bit of a dance of thinking about where someone's at, how we stretch, how we test, and how we help it to feel psychologically safe enough. And I think often in the therapeutic process, there needs to be a stretch. People kind of need to be able to move beyond the edges of what feels comfortable for growth. But yeah, keeping it safe enough, that we certainly wouldn't aim for any kind of therapeutic process to be traumatizing for someone, would we?
No, but I think, again, from a psychotherapy lens, we call these disjunctions, and they're
Mhm.
actually very helpful because, if you imagine that how we do anything is how we do everything. Like, so if
Mhm.
if a therapeutic relationship is another relationship in your life, and to your point, the therapist cancels, something happens, they can't make their
Mhm.
session, is that now traumatizing the patient? And it's not, I don't think anybody that works in this sort of way is intentionally trying to traumatize anyone, but it's helpful in a way to have an enactment of something that could
Mm.
also happen in real life, and to actually realize that sometimes people will let you down, and maybe it's not personal, and sometimes actually stuff happens, and maybe we can let's talk about it. Let's talk about
Mm.
what just happened there when we missed the session.
Mm.
And actually, this is an opportunity for the person to forge that new neural pathway, actually
Mm.
learn a completely different way to navigate that sense of abandonment.
So you call that a disjunction?
Yeah,
Yeah, in my world, we would call that rupture and repair.
yeah,
So
yeah,
thinking about, yeah, that ruptures will inevitably happen, but I guess
yeah,
it's what you do with that
yeah.
afterwards, and having the conversation and the repair, from that.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. It's good. It's good that those kinds of things need to happen. So, of course,
Mm.
there's also things that people can do themselves. So if somebody
Mhm.
who's listening to this is sort of thinking, well, maybe I might have a little bit of this going on. I think from a psychotherapy place, we would always be focusing on feelings, and I think, and looking at this in a right hemispheric way, it's art, feelings, music, meditation. These are kind of um, interventions that I think somebody that has this kind of, adaptation can do more of. If you're feeling really dysregulated, maybe write some notes about how you're feeling. Rather than what happened, focus on how am I feeling about this? What's the feeling here? Maybe do some art, play some music, do some meditation. Try to settle and just realize my nervous system is really unsettled right now. I've written about the
Mhm.
feelings. I feel anxious. I feel unsettled. What can I do to settle myself? And
Mm.
when you start these kinds of pieces of work, it's going to be hard in the beginning because you've never had to settle yourself that way. But it's just these tiny little steps can make such a difference long term. Mm.
And so often we don't have a language for our emotions. So we maybe know the big sort of, happy, sad, angry, but actually, if we've never learned or been around, being taught that when what language, what word do we put to feeling a certain way, that can be a real skill. So when we talk about naming the feeling, that can often be a really big piece for people to find the language,
Big
and
time.
then to connect the words to how does that feel for me? What kind of what is happening in my body? What types of thoughts am I having? How will I know if that's the feeling that's coming up? Almost like developing your own sense of what is my personal signature for when I know that this is the emotion that I'm feeling. And often by reconnecting with the emotion, you've got the so the right hemispheric activation, but you've also got that sense of being able to separate the feeling from the fact or from the event. So it's really then starting to bring us back into our bodies, and separating it from what may be going on around us, which I think does a whole bunch of different things. But one thing that really helps is bring us a greater sense of control. So we can think about then if we're identified what's going on in our bodies and how we're feeling, that can open up all those other things that you mentioned there, all the ways to regulate our nervous system. And different people find different things helpful in that domain. So thinking about then, when I feel this way, these kind of things tend to feel helpful or accessible or doable. So we can just really start to have more options when we're feeling distressed. I would also say one of the most helpful things, which I associate with being a very DBT thing, but it's quite logical. So I certainly don't think it would be the preserve of that particular way of working, is pausing before acting.
Mm.
So anything we can do to lengthen the gap between when we have an impulse to respond in a certain way or to do something, just being able to buy a little bit more space to create some more distance between the thought or the impulse and the action, can again just open up more opportunities to be choiceful in how we do it. And then I often think, having a plan when we're calm, when we're grounded and settled, thinking then, what will be my plan for if I am really distressed? What helps me? So don't wait until we're distressed and the sort of the frontal lobe is shut off, and then you're trying to make a plan or make decisions.
Yeah,
Making a plan for that when you're calm, that then becomes much easier for you just to access as and when you need it.
definitely. And
Mm.
I think that that impulse, when we're so dysregulated and so upset, and we're just running around trying to do everything to calm it down,
Mhm.
that's sort of we have the capacity in those moments to do really hectic things to try and just settle the system. So that's why having a little bit of a plan ahead of time to know, if I get to that state, how can I try and come back down? And sometimes that's really hard for the person. That's why therapy is so useful, is because
Mhm.
that's where you learn a lot of these techniques and ways to settle the self, have cohesion with the self, and actually come down like that. So, I would always recommend that somebody
Yeah.
that feels like this, go to therapy, go and do some
Yeah.
work. But
And I think the
settling
things with
yourself,
yeah.
if it's hard in the beginning, that's okay. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily going to be something you will just get overnight.
And I guess I was just smiling there because I was thinking this is not the preserve of people who might have attracted this diagnostic label. For any human being, when we get dysregulated, when our nervous system is really activated, and we may be making choices that we wouldn't make when we're calm, or doing things that may end up being things that we then have to resolve or unpick afterwards. That advice you gave, and the various tips we've given today, for anyone where those emotions are running high, it's really sound advice for
Mm,
absolutely anyone to think about how
mm.
we support ourselves when activation is running high.
Yeah. And just be kind.
Mm.
If you always imagine that if somebody really close to you that you really, really love was going through this, how kind you would be to them. It's
Mm.
really important to extend that kind of kindness to yourself as well. We don't need this and then a shame spiral on top of it. That just doesn't help. It's like oftentimes this is the failure of attunement that has happened that has caused this, and there's some work to be done to mend that sense of self. And a lot
Mm.
of that work is often relational and kind of reenacting the attunement again. So yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So that's it for today. Until next time when we will talk about all things health, relationships, and trauma. Till then, take care. The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counseling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.